The strongest sorcerer in history versus the strongest sorcerer of today. We're going to be breaking down these two representations of peak jujutsu in their battle IQ, comparing and contrasting to see who is superior in this regard. This is mainly going to be looking at their battle IQ and not their innate ability to use jujutsu. It does kind of get intertwined with this conversation, so I'll try and make note of it when it becomes relevant, but I think pretty much everybody will be able to understand it when we cross those points. During the opening sequences of Gojo vs Sukuna, after they get done just throwing hands for a little bit and, destroying the entirety of Shibuya, that they unleash their domain expansion, both being evenly matched and Gojo having to work out how to get around Sukuna's barrierless domain. He does this through a variety of tactics, specifically being when he recharges his burnt out curse technique through using the reverse curse technique in conjunction with simple domain, escaping Sukuna's barrier, leading to the second clash, where Gojo flips the internal and external conditions of his domain, where Sukuna, through a binding vow and having knowledge through Yuji that the only ones unaffected by infinite void are Gojo and anyone he's touching, is able to get the win during the second domain clash. We'll touch on these two and the third domain clash in a moment, but what I really want to talk about is the point right after that. We see in the fight Gojo monologue to himself after the third domain clash, questioning why Sukuna has been avoiding using any other curse techniques other than the one granted to his domain. Even when the interior strength of the barrier was lowered after Gojo flipped the internal and external conditions, Sukuna didn't even try to destroy it from the inside, instead choosing the riskier option. Gojo also notes that until his domain was destroyed from the outside, he had the upper hand for 3 minutes, while also having confirmation that Sukuna can't use buildings to attack while inside the domain. While the two are cancelling out each other's sure hit effects from within the domain, Sukuna had no other choice but to use domain amplification in order to beat Gojo's limitless curse technique. That's a huge advantage for Gojo. Yet, in spite of all of that, Gojo still doesn't know why Sukuna didn't even try to use the 10 Shadows technique or Maharaga in the domain. Gojo thinks it might be a case of Sukuna recalling Megumi and Gojo's conversation about the Zenin and Gojo clan, this conversation confirming that Gojo does have knowledge of Maharaga, Gojo being aware that Sukuna is also aware of this, yet is still completely unable to figure out what Sukuna is doing. This is a good point to bring up in relation to these two, as there's no point in this fight where Sukuna is quite as lost on what Gojo is doing. He is at points during the micro scale, but never on such a larger scale like with the domain clashes or the world cutting slash that we see towards the end of the fight. This follows exactly what happens after the 5th domain clash, where Gojo is completely stunned at Maharaga already having adapted to unlimited void. Gojo only figuring out that the one taking the burden of Maharaga's adaptation was Megumi's soul and not Sukuna himself. Conversely, Gojo's win condition simply just didn't rely on him doing anything else but landing infinite void, which is true, as when we see it land, Gojo destroys the part of Sukuna's brain responsible for barrier techniques, making domain expansion impossible for him. These strategies being partly rooted in character motivations, as Sukuna's goal in this fight is to not only defeat Gojo, but defeat the limitless technique as well. Hence why he chooses to go as far as to develop the world cutting slash, or why he'd even bother to say he'd adapt to limitless while he cuts Gojo to pieces with his domain. What happened during the domain clashes is Sukuna had an overarching idea of how he wanted to defeat infinite void, whereas Gojo was trying to win in any singular clash, as it would give him victory if infinite void hit even for a moment. Sukuna technically won in that he knew Gojo wouldn't be able to launch his domain one more time due to healing his brain right around the prefrontal cortex, and how Sukuna had more leeway since he had done this same technique fewer times. But at the same time, Gojo also technically won, since in his micro victories and reactive adaptations in the form of basketball domain, using simple domain plus using reverse curse technique on his burnt out curse technique, enabling him to use blue to actually grab Sukuna and launch red right in front of his face, allowing Gojo to escape the domain. All of this culminating more so in the later stages of their clashes, in Gojo being able to launch his domain slightly ahead of Sukuna, or Sukuna was slightly late in the opening of his domain, the difference being less than 0.01 seconds, but was long enough to immobilize Sukuna for just a moment. This is what allowed Gojo to actually pierce Sukuna's chest, and after that moment, they fought for 2 minutes and 40 seconds before Malevolent Shrine collapsed as a result of Sukuna's injuries, in which Unlimited Void connects on Sukuna, but Maharaga adapts. Before that adaptation, Sukuna's brain was damaged, essentially making the whole scenario, or the entirety of the domain clashes, null. Gojo's work in the micro was so strong to the extent that it had the same effect as Sukuna's work in the macro, but this overall does set the stage for how the rest of the fight will follow suit. Let's get a move on to round 2 and see how everything goes. During the the next phase of the fight, a similar story rings true. The setup is this: Sukuna is essentially stalling for Mahoraga to adapt to Limitless. Gojo, in order to avoid adaptation to his other techniques, is simply sticking with blue, which makes sense as he incorporates blue into his regular punches. What ensues between the two is a chase sequence with Gojo doing everything and anything in his power to actually knock Sukuna out or take him down before the adaptation completes. This is all part of a multi-layered failsafe by Gojo, or multiple on-the-fly plays that he makes in order to take Sukuna out. We see that Gojo, after strictly sticking with blue, does utilize red with his teleportation in order to catch Sukuna off guard. The first red does fail to take Sukuna out as he uses amplification to minimize the damage to him, even if it can't fully neutralize blue or red. Gojo, dissatisfied by this, uses blue to fling some rocks at Sukuna. This is the sloppy move that Sukuna mentions after Gojo lost his cool, and why there are rocks surrounding Sukuna after the fact. And although these rocks didn't accomplish much, what they did accomplish was keeping Sukuna in this position for a few seconds longer. Red instantly connecting with Sukuna's back. At the moment of impact, Sukuna surmises that Gojo, after memorizing the building's layout, planned from the start to have red strike after making a full lap around the building. The end goal was always to have red connect with Sukuna. It just required Gojo to perform a quick pop fly play with some slightly pre-established planning in order to make it work. Basically, either Sukuna didn't read the red here, took damage, the red goes around the building, and then he takes even more damage, or he did read the red, which is what happened, and forced Gojo to make a quick play with the blue, keep Sukuna in that position for a moment longer, red hitting him from behind, leading to the black flash. While there is more we're going to talk about, I want to make a bit of an analogy for how I look at Gojo and Sukuna as combatants. Gojo works better in reaction to unfavorable situations, creating workarounds to unstoppable problems on the fly or in the moment, as seen in the open domain clash. Gojo constantly creating solutions to the problem in the moment, trying to stop Sukuna's adaptation to infinity inside the building by knocking him out and creating the red strategy, or in landing his unlimited hollow purple at the end of the fight. Gojo's best moments are when he's put in a box and has to work out of it, when he's in a restricted state, so to speak. Sukuna, on the other hand, works better when he's the one acting or when he has absolute freedom to think of his strategies. That being planning for Mahoraga to adapt to Infinite Void via all the knowledge he's accumulated on the technique, either through his previous interactions with Gojo or just generally speaking, planning for Mahoraga to adapt to Limitless, and the obvious with the world-cutting slash at the end of the fight. It's kind of similar to some characters in the series of Blue Lock, where some players play better when they are in a restricted state and have their options limited, and other players play far better when they have more options at their disposal. Hence the restriction freedom analogy I made earlier. That doesn't mean either of these characters can't excel outside these categories. More so speaking in the context of this fight, I feel as if they excel in these particular categories. Sukuna is just a bit more different when he's in a restricted state or in restriction, not necessarily coming up with new strategies, which is more so the point of what we're looking at for this video, but instead more often than not opting on a binding vow, which is what ends up happening with the world cutting slash at the end of this fight, or maybe later on when you want to talk about Sukuna's incomplete domain that he uses against Jujutsu High, followed by his furnace. This is also another parallel between him and Gojo, where Sukuna more actively uses binding vows either with his domain or actual techniques, whereas Gojo more periodically uses incantations to restore power to lowered output techniques. While at this point in the fight Mahoraga has adapted to infinity, this isn't exactly what Sukuna wanted, or to be more specific, it isn't something that he can use for himself, which is the end goal of the fight, gaining something from this fight that he can use towards defeating the Limitless technique. We see Sukuna take on a more passive role, so to speak. Mahoraga, due to being adapted to infinity, is on offense, and to make sure Mahoraga doesn't get destroyed, Sukuna's on protection duty. He tries to make openings for Mahoraga to attack easily, while also using those openings to attack Gojo, like we see with the piercing blood attack. Sukuna is in a bit of a bind, as unless he applies it externally to his domain, he can't use his Shrine and 10 Shadows technique simultaneously, and as such is using Shikigami other than Mahoraga now, since the adaptation to infinity is complete. He generally has more resources to allocate. Having Gojo on a bit of a back foot at this point in the fight, Sukuna continues to pile on the pressure. Don't misunderstand, this isn't a 2-on-1, proceeding to summon new totality, making it a 3-on-1 against Gojo. This is worsened by the fact that red is no longer an option to take out Mahoraga on its own, barely being effective against Mahoraga, not just due to Gojo's output being on the decline, but due to the fact that Mahoraga took one hit from red earlier on head on, making the technique overall ineffective in taking out Mahoraga in one shot. At this point in the fight, Gojo's in a complete box. He can't take out Mahoraga with blue or red, meaning he'll have to take him out with purple. The problem with purple in this fight and why Gojo just doesn't fire it straight off is due to how the charge up takes ages. On top of it being stated here, this is a big point when Sukuna fights Yuta in Gojo's body, who isn't able to launch purple at Sukuna straight up, Sukuna remarking that he doesn't understand why Gojo was actually forced to fire purple in a roundabout way. Sukuna would have just recognized the spark for the curse technique purple and jumped in to stop it while the technique is being powered up, similarly to how he recognized the spark to reversal red later on in the fight. Like with that restriction point I mentioned earlier, I want you to visualize Gojo as a fighter, as whenever he's put in a box, given a select set of tools, he will always be able to break out of that box. This is exactly what happens towards the end of the fight. Gojo is pretty much just being jumped at this point by Agito and Mahoraga. Gojo more intent on focusing on Agito due to how it inherited Round Deer's powers, meaning that if it actually did heal Sukuna, that would be a huge problem for Gojo. Sukuna is in a weakened state due to Gojo's Black Flash, which is why he's so hesitant about purple and why he's so fixed on preventing Gojo from getting it off. Charging purple straight up would have never worked on Sukuna at this point in time, forcing Gojo to think outside the box. Gojo's thrown into further restriction as Mahoraga's adaptation accelerates, sending slashes flying out just like Sukuna. All three fighters from Team Sukuna proceeding to jump Gojo as a result of this, Gojo responding with a maximum output blue, destroying Agito in one hit. Landing a second Black Flash, it is noted that Gojo Satoru feels a rush of exhilaration or his voltage rises, while for the first time in 1,000 years, the King of Curses Ryomen Sukuna experiences the height of tension or is nervous. Cinema, by the way, just cinema. The voltage rise point is actually pretty prevalent in JJK, as it's synonymous with characters bringing out their absolute potential and shattering their pre-established limits, or what's considered their limits, it being noted here with Gojo unleashing a new variation of his ace technique outside domain expansion, it being brought up on two other separate occasions via chapter statements, one chapter statement being when Dabura actually resigns himself to fight as a warrior and shattered the limits of his body, hitting almost light speed. The other point being when Yuji faces off against Sukuna, stacking Black Flashes to reach his level or climb to a level close to Sukuna, the chapter statement noting both fighters feel their voltage spike. It is noted that Sukuna would have been able to regenerate his severed hands and crush the sorcerers of Jujutsu High, but due to the 7 Black Flashes by Yuji, who struck directly at the boundary between Sukuna and Megami Soul, it stopped any hopes of Sukuna recovering his reverse curse technique, but due to Sukuna's rush of Black Flashes, it allowed his malevolent shrine to burst forth once more with no loss of output or range. Furthermore, this is a different variation on Sukuna's domain, as he's using a one-handed hand sign for his domain expansion, it being noted that despite it being an incomplete domain, at this 11th hour, Sukuna had made no attempt at lowering the complexity of his domain as he was in Shibuya. By enveloping his domain in an outer shell barrier, the binding vow that allowed an escape route disappeared. This not only resulted in a narrowed range, but also changed his domain's operation. Within the materialized landscape, the sure hit would activate. Following Sukuna's furnace launch, you get the idea. The voltage rise is synonymous with Jujutsu sorcerers essentially pushing what is possible for them as individuals. A limit pusher, so to speak, generally brought about by the Black Flashes, but still the general point stands with the Dabura example thrown into the mix. During this point, Gojo then proceeds to stack 2 more Black Flashes, hitting Mahoraga with both, then charging up the incantations for red, which, like we established earlier, Sukuna was able to read and had planned to have Mahoraga adapt to red and take the hit for good measure, but this was never Gojo's plan. Gojo's plan in this restricted state was to get purple off, and in doing so, he already had a maximum output blue up above him. The only thing that was missing was red, which Gojo shoots directly upwards. Sukuna misreading not what Gojo was doing, but what he was going to do with the attack itself. Gojo in this moment also capitalizing on the fact that Mahoraga had already adapted to blue, allowing Gojo to capitalize on the attraction of blue, whereas Mahoraga wasn't able to due to it of already being adapted to it. Sukuna proceeds to shoot a piercing blood at the red in order to stop it. Gojo, however, cited the incantations for blue in a very short period of time, which restored its output, swallowing Sukuna's piercing blood. Gojo, then chanting the incantations for purple, launches his hollow technique, Unlimited Purple, a purple with no specific target, and attacking indiscriminately, destroying Mahoraga and leaving Sukuna in an extremely weakened state. The sheer difference in damage, even when Sukuna is using domain amplification, being massive, Gojo attributing the fate to his own cursed energy. Gojo had regained the ability to heal with his reverse curse technique output through those Black Flashes against the Sukuna with slowed healing, blink, no Maharaga, and an inability to do a lick of damage without amplification, it seems as if Gojo won. And he did, just not in time. As Sukuna's underlying plan, maybe even from the start of the series, was to create a technique to defeat the limitless jujutsu. What he desired for Maharaga was a model of how to tear through infinity. After the first adaptation, Maharaga was altering the essence of its own cursed energy in order to neutralize and nullify infinity. That is something Sukuna was just unable to replicate, so he was forced to continue to wait. He wanted to discover an adaptation to counter infinity that he could piggyback off of and use. The second adaptation is exactly what he had been anticipating, but it wasn't sending slashes flying as Sukuna does. It was expanding the technique's target. Its intended target wasn't just Gojo, but the space, the entire world, existence itself. It targeted everything before unleashing those slashes. Gojo's infinity meant nothing as long as it existed within that space, that world. It would be torn apart. This was a near impossible technique for Sukuna to pull off, but he had the perfect model to do so. The entire idea behind Gojo vs Sukuna is that he was future-proofing himself. He wanted a way for him to defeat the limitless technique that he could use even outside Maharaga. This is exactly in line with what we saw during the domain clashes. Sukuna has this underlying overarching strategy and win condition that he needs to get off. And everything between him getting that win condition off is just him focusing on surviving. That middle gray area was where Gojo excelled in the fight. If you actually segment Sukuna versus Gojo into rounds, more often than not, Gojo does look better and come out on top due to the fact that he works a lot better in these encapsulated rounds, as that's kind of where his win conditions lie. Sukuna's win conditions that he chose for this specific fight were much more overarching and long-term, so to speak. The way I could describe it is that Sukuna went into this fight with an exact idea of how he wanted to win, whereas Gojo went into this fight without any real plan in mind. It was essentially his confidence in his ability to react to everything on the battlefield and in his own strength and curse techniques that enabled him to perform these strategies that he did. Hence why he was either performing strategies that Sukuna wasn't prepared for, or why he was showing Sukuna things that Sukuna had never seen before, like the Gojo Satoru reverse curse technique, using RCT on your own burnout curse technique that Sukuna followed and copied after that point. One fighter had absolute confidence in their ability to get a plan off, the other had absolute confidence in their ability to react to what the other brought to the table. Not saying Gojo isn't capable of planning strategies or Sukuna doesn't do well in reaction, as I don't think that is the case. Sukuna would be an overall better tactician in his ability to plan and come up with a win con, whereas Gojo is showcased to get the edge when he's forced into these unwinnable situations, put in a box and forced to react or come up with a micro strategy in order to beat Sukuna, surprising him at every turn every time he's put in this position. That's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think down below. Do you agree, disagree, why? All that good stuff. I will catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.